From the observation deck of the crystalline palace, the young alien princess, though human-like in form, moved with a grace that seemed rehearsed for a stage she had never chosen to perform on. Her world was one of gilded surfaces, polished floors that reflected the complex geometries of the grand halls, and corridors suffused with the warm, golden glow of artificially controlled sunlight. The architects of her life had ensured everything was orderly, everything pristine, and most importantly, everything safe. She had never seen the underside of existence. Blood, sweat, scars, or the chaotic irregularity of life beyond palace walls were abstractions, intellectual curiosities whispered about by tutors who spoke of war and suffering as if they were faint echoes of a storybook. Her hands, delicate and perfectly symmetrical, had never touched instruments of labor or battle. Her eyes, large and luminous, mirrored the carefully maintained perfection around her, yet they could not reflect experience, for experience was something she had never earned. The palace itself was a machine of opulence. Golden veins threaded through walls that seemed alive, pulsating subtly with energy drawn from the planet's magnetic field. Each chamber had been designed to cater to her every whim, yet each design carried an unspoken message. The world was for her enjoyment, not her understanding. Courtiers and attendants moved around her with precise, muted efficiency, their eyes always cast downward in deference, never daring to meet hers fully. She was the apex of her civilization's creation, a jewel in a setting so carefully controlled it resembled a museum more than a living world. Yet, despite all of this, there was a subtle undercurrent of dissatisfaction, one she could not articulate. The perfect symmetry of her life felt like a mirror that reflected her own limitations back at her. She could calculate the trajectory of a shuttle as it moved through the palace's orbital docks, debate the merits of political treaties, or recite the histories of her people with flawless precision. But she had never felt the consequences of life unshielded, never known the heat of fear or the weight of responsibility that could not be deflected by wealth, beauty, or influence. Her knowledge was complete. Her understanding remained hollow. It was on one day, unremarkable in its engineered perfection, that the anomaly appeared. A human soldier, unremarkable by the standards of his own species, but entirely alien in every measure she had learned, arrived in her palace. His uniform was threadbare compared to the gilded armor of her ceremonial guards, his movements uneven, marked by small inefficiencies that spoke of exhaustion and exposure. His skin bore marks of sun and abrasion, his hands scarred from toil, and his eyes carried a fatigue born not of boredom but of survival. He was a living contradiction to the order she had always known, imperfect, vulnerable, yet undeniably alive. The first time she saw him, she did not approach. Her observation was detached, instinctively analytical. She noted the way he carried himself, the slight limp in his gait, the tension in his shoulders as though his body were perpetually braced against an unseen force. And yet there was something magnetic in his presence, an authenticity that pulled her gaze despite her attempts at indifference. In the perfection of her world, nothing had ever demanded attention so insistently. He did not speak immediately. He was not awed, nor did he tremble at her presence. In the palace, such reactions were mandatory. Failure to comply was considered a social breach, sometimes punished with removal from her proximity, or even exile. But he stood with a quiet determination, a subtle insistence that he was not a piece of the scenery. His uniform was marked with the symbols of campaigns she had only read about, campaigns that had left scars across human colonies and star systems. Those marks, both literal and figurative, spoke of struggle, danger, and the exercise of choice under duress. From her elevated position, she watched him navigate the corridors, observing interactions with attendants who flinched or whispered in surprise. It was not fear that emanated from him. It was awareness, constant and unyielding. Each step seemed deliberate, measured against risks and necessity, rather than decorum. To her, he was chaos in motion, yet there was a rhythm to his movement, a pattern forged not by rules of protocol but by experience. And it fascinated her. It provoked something she had never felt, curiosity tempered with longing, the urge to reach beyond the glass walls of her gilded cage. She had been trained to manage crises, to anticipate threats and simulations, yet the raw presence of lived struggle was an entirely different phenomenon. It was a language she had never understood, spoken not in words but in the body's subtle articulations, the set of a jaw, the tension in a shoulder, the careful weight of a step. She found herself lingering near the observation deck long after the human soldier had been escorted to the audience chamber. Her reflection in the polished glass betrayed more than the calculated composure she usually maintained. She studied her own hands, so unscarred, so clean, and wondered, without admitting the thought aloud, what it would feel like to bear marks of choice, of consequence, of survival. Her world, previously complete, now seemed like a delicate illusion. And yet, there was apprehension. To engage with him, to truly see him beyond the surface of observation, would mean to acknowledge the fragility of her own existence. The palace's perfection could not protect her from the revelations his presence promised. And so she waited, torn between the impulse to retreat into the comfort of control and the irresistible allure of experience unmediated by opulence. Outside, the garden terraces stretched like a woven tapestry of bioluminescent flora, their engineered beauty reflecting in pools of still water. The princess moved toward them, driven by a restless energy that felt both foreign and inevitable. Her gaze fell again on the human soldier as he paused, adjusting to the palace's alien architecture, seemingly unaware of her scrutiny. And in that suspended moment, she realized that nothing, no lesson, no tutor, no simulation, could prepare her for the world he represented. He was not an ornament, not a reflection of her status, not a tool to be managed. He was life, raw and unpolished, bearing all the contradictions of imperfection. And she, for the first time, recognized the fragile cage she had inhabited all her life. Something had shifted. In the cold symmetry of her palace, under the orchestrated light of artificial suns, the princess understood that her story, once predictable and controlled, had entered an unpredictable trajectory. The human soldier, indifferent yet present, had pierced her gilded existence, not with aggression, but with authenticity. And in that revelation lay the seed of transformation, one she could not yet name, and one the palace's gold and glass could never contain. From the vantage of the palace's grand atrium, the human soldier moved cautiously, aware of every reflective surface, every silent observer hidden in the latticed shadows. To him, the palace was less a home than a trap disguised in brilliance. Each corridor gleamed with polished alloys and crystalline panels that refracted light like prismatic illusions, and each step he took echoed faintly, reminding him of the unnatural stillness of the place. His world, scarred, chaotic, and brutal, had never prepared him for such calculated beauty. He had crossed systems, survived skirmishes, endured starvation and exposure, and yet this palace presented a challenge unlike any battlefield. Here, the enemy was not armed in conventional terms. It was the very perfection of space, designed to ensnare the senses and disorient the mind. To a human untrained in the subtleties of alien culture, every reflective surface was a potential observation point, every ornamental detail a silent test of composure. Yet he did not falter. The soldier's eyes, hardened by countless campaigns, flicked from one corridor to another with precise calculation. He noted the attendants' glances, the way they held themselves, the way their movements avoided contact, the faint tremor in their hands. He recognized the subtle language of fear and submission, not as a threat to him personally, but as a reflection of the societal machinery that had crafted this palace. The human mind instinctively seeks patterns, and he catalogued each one, silently constructing a map of influence, hierarchy, and behavior. It was in the audience chamber that he first saw her properly. The princess, her presence radiating both authority and fragility, stood framed by the ornate windows behind her, sunlight spilling in like molten gold. Her eyes, wide and luminous, observed him with an intensity that was both disarming and compelling. Unlike the attendants who avoided his gaze, she met it, unflinching, yet without obvious understanding of what it meant to confront life so directly. He noted her posture, poised, controlled, a careful balance of elegance and command. But even to his trained eye, there was a subtle tension, an undercurrent of curiosity beneath the mask of composure. He could see the conflict etched into her expression, a mixture of intrigue, caution, and an almost imperceptible hunger for something beyond the scripted perfection of her existence. The soldier had been briefed, of course. His mission required diplomacy, observation, and minimal disruption. Yet instinctively, he understood that his presence alone was a catalyst. In every subtle gesture, the angle of his head, the slight unevenness in his stride, the way his hands bore the marks of experience, he communicated a reality the princess had never faced. Life unshielded, life with stakes, life in which every choice bore consequence. He approached the dais with measured steps, conscious of the gravity of the moment. In his world, actions were judged by survival outcomes, by whether they would prolong life or sacrifice it. Here, in this palace of light and reflection, the parameters were alien, yet he moved as though every step were a negotiation between instinct and observation. He did not speak immediately, allowing silence to carry meaning. To the princess, this was unusual. Attendants had trained her to expect immediate reverence, verbal acknowledgement, or a scripted bow. Silence, however, demanded contemplation. The princess's eyes tracked him, and for the first time, she experienced the unnerving weight of being truly seen by another being, not as royalty, not as perfection, but as a sentient individual. She could feel the gravity of his presence, the quiet authority that comes from lived experience, and an awareness began to stir. She had never encountered a mind so shaped by consequence, so attuned to the raw edges of existence. The soldier finally spoke, his voice even, measured, carrying no trace of arrogance, only presence. Words were not his weapon. He relied on clarity, precision, and the economy of truth. He introduced himself, gave his origin, his mission, and in the process, revealed the scars of survival not as a boast but as matter-of-fact markers of life lived in the face of adversity. Every pause, every emphasis in his speech, seemed to draw the princess closer, not physically, but intellectually, emotionally, in a way that disrupted the perfection of her mental constructs. She listened, unaccustomed to genuine dialogue that carried weight beyond etiquette or political calculation. The courtiers whispered among themselves, their murmurings a soft backdrop to the tension coiling between the two figures. She realized, almost painfully, that she had been trained to manage representations of life, data, simulations, theories, but not life itself. And here it was, embodied, unpredictable, tangible. The soldier's hands, marked by labor and battle, gestured naturally as he spoke. His movements were functional, honest, devoid of ornamentation. To the princess, they were revelations. She found herself studying them, tracing the scars, the calluses, the minor imperfections that told a story of endurance and choice. Each mark was a narrative of challenge met and survived, and she felt, for the first time, the gap between her own experience and the richness of unmediated life. Curiosity began to override her habitual composure. Small questions emerged, silent, hesitant, as if afraid to breach decorum yet impossible to suppress. How does one endure pain without retreating? How does one navigate moral ambiguity when the stakes are life itself? The soldier did not answer directly. His presence alone was the lesson. He embodied the answers through every scar, every scarred knuckle, every deliberate step. Time, in the palace, usually followed predictable cycles. But with his arrival, those cycles fractured. Minutes stretched and contracted unpredictably as she observed him, trying to reconcile the life she had known with the life she now glimpsed through him. The sunlight through the windows no longer felt static. It highlighted imperfections and choices, failures and successes, and a depth of reality she had never perceived. And yet, she was still constrained. Courtiers reminded her, subtly yet insistently, that she was a princess, a symbol of order and control. But for the first time, she felt that symbols were fragile, that authority without understanding was hollow. The soldier, unaware, perhaps deliberately so, had shifted the axis of her perception. In the subtle tension of his gaze, the understated gravity of his presence, and the indelible mark of his experiences, he had introduced the concept of consequence beyond gold, glass, or protocol. As the audience drew to a close, and he was guided to his quarters within the palace, she lingered. The air around her seemed charged with unspoken potential, as though a threshold had been crossed that could not be undone. In the quiet of the chamber, she touched the edge of a reflective surface, tracing the line of her own face against the prism of light, and felt, with startling clarity, that she had glimpsed something forbidden yet necessary, a world outside perfection, where life was defined not by control but by endurance, choice, and the subtle, unglamorous courage of existence itself. The palace remained unchanged. Gold veins glimmered. Courtiers whispered in rehearsed patterns. But inside the princess, something had shifted irrevocably. The human soldier, scarred, imperfect, real, was a mirror showing her the gap between life imagined and life lived. And in that reflection, a seed had been planted, a quiet yet insistent impulse that would guide her toward a confrontation with reality she had never anticipated, and a transformation she could neither avoid nor ignore. The palace corridors, once a tableau of controlled elegance, had become a landscape of subtle disruptions. The princess moved with deliberate intention now, her gaze occasionally flicking to the human soldiers' quarters, a curiosity she could neither suppress nor fully understand. She was acutely aware that each of her movements, once effortless displays of grace and perfection, was now measured against the uncertainty he introduced. The world outside the palace, the world of risk and imperfection, had invaded her carefully curated life. He had begun to adapt as well. Though constrained by protocol, he navigated the palace with a cautious confidence born of survival. Every interaction with attendants, courtiers, or the princess herself was a negotiation, a dance of observation and discretion. He recognized the fragility of the environment, one misstep, one gesture misinterpreted, and the equilibrium of this gilded ecosystem could collapse. Yet, paradoxically, it was in this tension that he thrived. Imperfection, after all, was his domain. He had been forged in its fires. Their first true conversation was neither grand nor ceremonial. It occurred in a quiet garden terrace, a secluded space where bioluminescent flora cast soft shadows over polished pathways. The princess approached him with hesitant steps, each one betraying a struggle between protocol and instinct. She spoke cautiously, her voice carrying the faint echo of tutelage, but layered with a nascent curiosity that had no precedent in her education. "You move differently here," she said, gesturing toward his uniform and the wear evident on his boots. "Not out of fear, not out of deference, but purpose." The soldier studied her with quiet scrutiny, his jaw tightening slightly. "Purpose is all a human has," he said simply. "Survival demands it. Sometimes it's ugly. Sometimes it's silent. But it's real. It isn't measured in gold or protocol, it's measured in moments like this, where the choice is to act or falter." Her eyes widened imperceptibly, tracing the depth of meaning in his words. In her life, decisions had always been buffered by layers of security and prediction. Here, the choices were immediate, unforgiving, and profoundly human. She had read about courage, had theorized about suffering, but had never experienced the existential weight of either. The soldier's words were less a statement than a reflection of lived reality, one that she had only just begun to glimpse. She walked alongside him, noting how he adjusted to the alien architecture, how his body compensated for angles and surfaces that defied standard ergonomics. Each movement, subtle and efficient, was an articulation of knowledge born from exposure, risk, and the necessity to adapt. In contrast, she felt a sudden awareness of her own body, how untested it was, how unscarred, how unaccustomed to exertion beyond the ceremonial. The realization was unsettling, yet intoxicating. "Do you fear this place?" she asked cautiously, as if speaking too openly could shatter the delicate equilibrium between them. He paused, one hand brushing against the railing, fingers tracing the smooth, unnatural surface. "No. Not fear. Awareness, maybe. Caution. You learn to distinguish them early. Fear paralyzes, awareness directs. Every environment teaches a language, and I've learned to read it quickly." The princess considered this. Awareness, not fear. In her world, fear had been abstract, a concept discussed in philosophy classes and historical analyses. Awareness was a tool she had never been allowed to wield, a sharpened edge she now felt pressing against the smooth contours of her life. She realized that in his presence, she was learning to perceive, not merely observe, to anticipate, not merely imagine. Their walks became quiet exercises in mutual observation. She noticed the way he assessed corridors, doorways, and ceilings, how his eyes flicked to subtle movements that suggested surveillance or intent, how he catalogued the architecture and behavior of the palace with almost tactile precision. She, in turn, found herself mimicking his observational methods, trying to internalize his approach, to inhabit a mode of perception that demanded engagement rather than passive admiration. It was during these interactions that the first fissures of trust began to appear. He had no authority here, yet she allowed herself to confide small uncertainties, questions about the world outside the palace, about the soldiers' campaigns, about the unpredictability of life itself. In turn, he shared fragments of his experiences, not the grand tales of heroism, but the granular moments of decision, consequence, and endurance. Each story was a lesson, delivered in fragments, that chipped away at the princess's preconceived notions of invulnerability. The palace, for all its perfection, resisted them. Attendants whispered, mechanisms adjusted, and the architecture itself seemed designed to maintain separation. Yet they persisted. The tension between their worlds, one of curated luxury, one of lived peril, was not a clash of violence, but of perception. And in that tension, a subtle transformation began. The princess's understanding of reality deepened, not through instruction, but through encounter. The soldier's understanding of diplomacy and human, or rather alien, behavior expanded, not through coercion, but through observation. By the time their walk ended, shadows had lengthened across the terrace. The bioluminescent flora glimmered faintly, casting shifting patterns across their faces. She felt a tremor of something she could not name, recognition of the world's imperfection, the thrill of engagement with danger, and the unsettling, exhilarating awareness of autonomy. For the soldier, the encounter was less dramatic but no less significant. He had observed the subtle mechanisms of power at work, the fragile boundaries that could collapse under pressure, and the potential for influence in even the smallest gestures. That evening, in the quiet of her chambers, the princess stood before a mirror, examining her reflection in a way she had never done before. The contours of her face seemed unchanged, yet she sensed a shift within, an internal vibration, a questioning, a tentative understanding that her life, once scripted, predictable, and perfect, was now entering a space of possibility. And that space was shaped by the presence of a being whose imperfection was its own kind of perfection, a human soldier whose scars told stories her tutors never could. She touched her reflection, half expecting to see the marks of change on her skin. There were none, of course. But in the silence of that moment she felt the first stirrings of transformation, the recognition that experience, not status, defined reality, that risk, not protocol, defined courage, and that contact with life outside her gilded cage was both inevitable and irreversible. The collision of their worlds had only just begun. The palace, in its gleaming perfection, had begun to feel strangely hollow. Gold veins in the walls reflected sunlight as though nothing had changed, yet to the princess, every shimmer now carried a new weight, a subtle reminder that perfection was no longer sufficient. Her world, once insulated, orderly, and unchallengeable, had shifted imperceptibly the moment the human soldier entered it. His presence was a disturbance, a vector of reality that pierced the illusions she had grown up within. She watched him again from the upper balcony, noting the way his eyes scanned corridors and chambers as if calculating the life within them. He did not look at her with awe, nor with fear, but with awareness, the kind that recognized consequence, responsibility, and fragility. In that awareness lay an unspoken assertion: life could not be contained by walls, no matter how golden or reflective. For the first time, she understood that the palace was not a sanctuary but a cage, and that her understanding of existence had been artificially constrained. She had been trained in histories, politics, mathematics, diplomacy, and culture, yet all her learning had been sterile abstract. Here, standing at the precipice of knowledge and lived experience, she realized that theory was useless without consequence, that knowledge without engagement was hollow. The soldier's movements that morning had been precise yet relaxed, the product of habitual risk assessment, and survival instinct. He navigated not just the architecture, but the invisible pressures of expectation, protocol, and observation. Every glance, every micro-gesture, every pause carried meaning. He did not need to speak to teach. Presence alone was a lesson. And she had been learning, unconsciously yet voraciously, from the language of his body, from the evidence of experience etched in his scars and demeanor. She descended to the terrace, moving closer than ever before, closing the distance that her upbringing had dictated should remain vast. The air between them was charged, not with romance, nor with confrontation, but with mutual recognition. They were observers of each other, yet participants in the slow rewriting of her world. The human soldier, who had endured campaigns she could only imagine, and she, who had been confined to perfection, were now co-authors of a new reality. "You are not like the others," she said finally, her voice steady yet revealing traces of wonder. "No one in my life has ever moved through it with such certainty." He did not respond immediately, his gaze lingering on her with quiet evaluation. "Certainty," he said at last, "is rarely given. It is earned. Life forces you to take it, one choice at a time. And sometimes, the only certainty is that nothing remains as it seems." Her eyes followed the faint movement of his hands, scarred, calloused, functional yet expressive, and she realized that the human definition of perfection lay not in symmetry, polish, or obedience, but in endurance, adaptability, and honesty. She had never encountered such a standard, and it challenged everything she had been taught. The sun, casting long shadows across the terrace, illuminated the fine line between their worlds. On one side, the palace, golden, ordered, insulated. On the other, the soldier, raw, imperfect, real. And somewhere between them existed the bridge she had never known she needed to cross. The bridge from abstraction to experience, from observation to participation, from theory to reality. She extended her hand, not as a gesture of ceremony, but as an acknowledgement of choice. To reach beyond walls, beyond security, beyond the gilded cage that had defined her existence. He accepted the gesture without hesitation, and in that simple act, the balance shifted. The palace remained the same in structure, yet for the first time, its walls did not dictate the bounds of her world. Experience had arrived, carried on the shoulders of imperfection, and it was irrevocable. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, the depth of understanding passed silently between them. Neither needed words to articulate the transformation occurring within. The princess's world, once predictable, untouchable, and sterile, had been rewritten by the subtle yet undeniable gravity of the soldier's presence. Her mind, trained for calculation and observation, now recognized the unpredictability of life and the beauty inherent in imperfection. His mind, hardened by survival and shaped by consequence, had begun to perceive nuances in diplomacy, patience, and trust that no battlefield could teach. The courtyard around them, the glimmering palace, the attendants moving silently, all were unchanged on the surface, yet the atmosphere vibrated with a quiet revolution. Change did not require upheaval. It required recognition, presence, and a willingness to see the world, and oneself, without filters. In that stillness, the princess finally understood that life could not be curated, controlled, or shielded from consequence. It could only be experienced, fully and unreservedly. And so, standing together amidst the engineered beauty of the palace, two beings from disparate worlds acknowledged the subtle but undeniable truth. Growth, understanding, and transformation were born not of perfection, but of engagement with imperfection. She had been sheltered in opulence, untouchable and safe. He had been scarred by struggle, unyielding and real. Yet here, in their shared awareness, a new equilibrium emerged, one that would shape not just her perspective, but the very essence of the palace's golden corridors. The princess finally smiled, a small, quiet acknowledgement of revelation rather than frivolity. The soldier returned the gesture, equally restrained, equally loaded with unspoken meaning. Neither required fanfare, either required applause. They were witnesses to the subtleties of life, to the slow collision of worlds, to the emergence of understanding in its rawest form. In that luminous moment, the palace ceased to be a cage. It became a canvas, a space on which the living world could be painted with consequence, awareness, and choice. And as the sun descended, casting its golden light across polished floors and reflective walls, the princess realized that she had glimpsed the truth. Life, with all its scars and imperfections, was infinitely more profound than any perfection she had ever known. The gilded cage had been opened, not by rebellion, not by violence, but by presence. And in that quiet, unassuming revolution, her world, and perhaps her very self, had been forever altered.